Welcome to Unbuckled Comics. If you're new, welcome. There's a liability form on the back table next to the comfy padded stadium seats. Grab them and get comfy. If you're returning, thank you for your continued support. I am Unbuckled Cape, your host of this comic book review podcast, and today we have a out of place episode. We're here dropping on a Thursday. Unbuckled Comics normally drops on Tuesday. What is going on? Well, let me tell you, we have another interview to get out to you before the Hershey Comic Con coming up in just a week. We are only a week away from the Hershey Comic Con, and I couldn't be more excited to go to that. And I can't be more excited to share this interview I did with G Chichester. But before we head out on patrol, let's gather some intel first. Hey, I got a link tree for you. linktr.ee. Let's try that again. linktr.ee/unbuckled comics. You can go over there and find all of my links to all of my social medias and such. And again, just a reminder that Patreon is ending, so don't go to the Patreon link. I probably should just pull it down, but I'll wait till I delete Patreon because, well, that's the way I'm gonna do it. I just do things. I'm just a dog chasing tires. I wouldn't know what to do if I actually caught one. Uh, anyway, I might just end this intro and go watch that movie now. Anyway, yeah, I got no updates because this is an interview episode, and we're gonna jump right into that interview. All right, and to conclude the three Hershey Comic Con show interviews that we are doing, welcoming to the show Dan Chichester. Dan, how are you? And thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Logan. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, or whenever this is airing. It's tonight for us right now, and yeah, thrilled to be part of this.
So you are a comic book writer, is that correct?
Yes, some would dispute that, but yes, I will say that I'm a comic book writer. I have been a comic book editor, as well. I started off as an editor, many years ago, and continue to write more than edit.
Oh, so you actually started off as an editor rather than a writer.
Yes, I started off as started off as an assistant to the editorial department. I became an assistant editor, and then from there would become a full-fledged editor. And I credit that role with, if I got good at writing, was being able to work with other people on their projects, and really good people, and learn from them. Observing what they were doing, seeing how they would write scripts, how they would approach stories. So that was a real great training ground, that I had so many really great writers that I was able to watch and learn from.
Wow. See, I always kind of thought, and maybe your route there is a little more non-traditional, but I always kind of thought it was the opposite, where people started off as writers and moved into the editorial roles.
It can go either way. I think it was not my intention for comics to become a career, as it did. I sort of took the job at Marvel as a way station, thinking it was going to go on to something else. But the opportunities to tell stories and to work with the characters and work with so many great creators became its own thing. And so that's an unexpected turn in life, but life is filled with unexpected turns.
So you went into Marvel thinking that was gonna just kind of be a stopping point for you. Does that, when you were young, were you like always interested in comics, or was it just hey, there's this place called Marvel, I think I can work for them for a little bit?
I had been hugely into comics when I was young. Big comic collector, big comic reader, but had stopped reading, I don't know when, 12, 13, for reasons I couldn't tell you why. It's not like I woke up one day and said I'm not interested in these, or these are juvenile or anything like that. It just, I seemed to stop. I stopped. I kept them though, kept them, dresser drawers full of them. I didn't have long boxes. I had thrown all my clothes on the floor and used the drawers to hold my comics. And but had then gone to film school. Film school kind of tapped me out financially, and then the student employment office had a job advertisement for a typist at Marvel Comics, and it kind of clicked together for me to say, well, geez, I'm in the screenwriting program. I type fast, and I know comics from when I read comics as a kid. So this sounds like a pretty good, easy gig while I'm finishing up school. Put a few hours in every day or every week or whatever it would be, and that was the door in. Again, not expecting that would become something more, because that typist job had actually been given away by the time I got there for the interview. And they said, well, geez, we're really sorry, but there is a job opening as the assistant to the editor in chief. So Lynn Cohen was Jim Shooter's assistant, and she needed an assistant. So I became Lynn Cohen's gopher, and but was positioned right outside Jim Shooter's office when Jim was editor in chief of Marvel Comics. So I got to sort of learn by doing, and then from there, that would later lead to becoming an assistant editor in the Epic Comics division.
Wow. So you started in Marvel when Jim Shooter was editor in chief, and I mean that was about the time where Marvel really started to take off, was it not?
Oh yeah, I mean they were doing gangbusters. Secret Wars was on fire. That was, I think, about when I came in, when Secret Wars was starting or about to, maybe midway through, that sort of thing. So there was a lot of amazing things, happening. I would have started, probably 84. That when I was still in school.
Wow. So you were the assistant to Jim Shooter's assistant.
Yes, important distinction.
What? Yeah, yeah. So I mean, you joke that you were a gopher. I mean, what did you do?
Well, you did some practical things. You'd answer the phones as they come through Jim's department, and there might be calls from editors, might be calls from freelancers, could be random calls from the public that had been routed from the switchboard, and they didn't know where else to send them, so they'd send them back there. So you'd have to field the calls or answer general questions about Marvel. There was sometimes there were approvals that had to get done on certain books, sign-offs from different editors, sign-offs from the sales department, and such. So sometimes I would have to take the books as they had come through that area, and I'd have to take them around and collect the proper sign-offs and signatures. There were a couple of books that needed some low-level editorial production work done on them. There was a Bernie Wrightson Spider-Man graphic novel that I did some pagination, which means making sure the pages in the right order, and that all the lettering was in the right position, that sort of thing. It was checked over by more experienced editors, but I would do that, and then I would do whatever crazy thing. Sometimes Jim needed through Lynn. There was one time he wanted to get a toy stuffed turkey, not a stuffed real turkey, but a plush turkey, for one of the people in the bullpen. I think it was Jack Abel, and so he said, go find me a colorful toy stuffed turkey. And in the days that predated the internet,
sure,
it wasn't quite as easy to kind of go out even on the streets of New York and say, well, where am I going to find a toy stuffed turkey? So those type of things would crop up, and but it was a great chance to meet a lot of the editors on staff, because you'd be going around to their offices and you'd learn their personalities, and getting those sign-offs or those things moved around, so it was a central place to absorb a lot of knowledge. again, not knowing that this was going to become something bigger, but
Yeah.
I got to be a magnet for it at the same time.
So at what point did you start editing?
Well, I had gone back home over the summer. I had one more semester to do school, and over the summer, the Epic Comics department, which was led by Archie Goodwin, Joe Duffy, they called me and said, "Well, we need an assistant. We need a real assistant." And I explained to them I still had a semester to go, but they were open to me coming in and being an assistant editor, even part time. I guess they'd heard reasonably good things about me, and so I did that for the final semester of school. And my theory then was, it would be good to have a job right after graduation. I was still not thinking comics was going to become a career. I was thinking I was going to go west, go to Hollywood, do all these film school student sort of things. And I was just looking for a segue post graduation where I could have some income in a kind of a guaranteed way. But as I was doing that assistant editor's work, that became more involved in the editorial end of it. I was not responsible for a book, but I was now more responsible in learning all the technical details that would go into creating a comic. I was connecting with freelancers and creators on a more editorial basis, not trafficking to some degree. By that I mean, checking on schedules, stuff coming in, did you send it in, or sending things out maybe to a letterer, and every now and again maybe having an opinion to share with an editor, like an Archie or Joe or Margaret Clark was one of the other editors in the department, uh, about, well, how's this story going? How does this look? And then based on their reaction, I would know whether I was onto something or I was being an idiot.
So then you move into an editor.
Yes. So Joe Duffy would leave the department maybe a year or so later. And that meant that Margaret Clark was moved up one level to Joe's prior position. And that left an opening for a more full editor. So I became a full editor within the Epic department,
And at
and then
that
took
point, did you
on.
think that comics was going to be a full time job?
It started to feel more like it. I still wanted to write more than I wanted to edit. That was really my desire, was to be more recognized as a writer and have a chance to tell stories. But I was still a little bit uncertain, nervous, inexperienced about it. And editorially, I felt stronger about myself than I did about being a writer. But I still think I was looking a bit more to what's next than focusing so much on what was happening, which maybe wasn't the smartest thing, but it started to, as the writing assignments then started to kind of pick up, then it felt like, well, this is pretty good. This is a way to tell stories, and something to focus on more. And then I would ultimately leave staff by my choice to focus more on the writing full time.
And do you know what your first published book as a writer was?
Excellent question. I think it was probably a fill-in issue of Justice, which was one of the New Universe books. Um, because I was writing with Margaret Clark at that time. We were co-writing titles, and we thought our individual skills and such could help bolster each other as we were trying to get our own writing creds built up. So we had written a number of inventory issues. So it was either, which means stories written for editors that may never run, but they sort of
Mm-hmm.
kept, at the ready in the event that the regular team blew the schedule. So we had written a West Coast Avengers, we had written a Justice, we had written a short solo Avengers story, an 8-page solo Avengers story. Um, so somewhere in amongst those three, uh, one of those was the first thing to actually go into print, and I'm pretty sure it was the Justice one.
So what's, I mean, you had worked through the editor line of the comic production,
Hmm.
desiring to be a writer, and then you have that first book published, whichever the three it is. Uh,
Hmm.
what was that feeling like for you?
Pretty wild. I mean, to see your name in print and your name's in the credit box. Uh, it's pretty impressive, to yourself, maybe not to others. And to see the story come to life, because the first thing before that happens is, of course, you're seeing the artwork come back from a talented artist, and that's a pretty big deal to see words that you put down, even if you put them down in a fair amount of detail, which we did, to then come to life through an artist's interpretation is is a is a little bit like magic, right? There's a bit of a magic trick, where you know you throw the cloth over the table and you whip it off, and there's something else beneath it. You haven't done all that magic because there's another performer there in the form of the artist, but you've helped influence it, and that was pretty crazy to be able to get that going. And then, of course, practically speaking, you start to look at those opportunities as a stepping stone to something more, because now you're not just chasing these inventory issues. You have a credit that you can say, well, I wrote this, and that's an easier proof point for other editors to maybe consider you for something else.
Yeah, so maybe you can help me take a peek up the magician's sleeve a little bit closer.
Sure.
What is the whole process like? I mean, I understand that if you are writing a book, you get a story down, you maybe write some bullet points down, you rough draft it, you do a second, third, fourth draft. But what is it like writing for a comic? How is that different from writing maybe a nonfiction novel or a
A,
fiction novel
a
or
fiction novel.
yeah.
Well, you are ultimately going to have the words that you're putting down be interpreted and transformed by an artist. And so that's the key thing. You can write as much as you want in the description of the plot, or if you do it a script, more like a screenplay in those days, is writing still very much like a plot. And by that I mean page 1 to 4 and a very detailed description of what happens page 1 to 4, page 5 to 12, very detailed description of what happens across those sequence of scenes. And then the artist is then going to follow along your beats, but he or she may decide to interpret it in different ways. Maybe something you thought was going to be an 8 panel grid on a page, they see it in their heads and they say, oh, I'm going to make this work in a big splash image. And that's part of the hopefully the good magic of what comes forward. But you're trying to inspire the artist, and you're trying to pace the story, and you're trying to create the visual hooks that are then going to communicate to that artist the things that are going to then come to life on the page. So you're in a collaborative place. You're not, at least for me, you're not writing. Even if you don't know who the artist is, there's going to be an artist. So you're not writing in isolation, and you have to be mindful of you're not asking somebody to do an entire Starfleet battle with 40,000 aliens in 500 ships, and planets exploding, and that's all in panel one. You've got to think about what the artist is going to be able to do and how that pacing is going to go on. So the descriptions you're putting there are somewhat like screen directions in a screenplay, but a little bit different. And then if you're doing it in a plot, you're also then sometimes, as I do, put in a lot of suggestions of what the dialogue is going to be. Daredevil is going to
Okay.
say this. Nick Fury is going to say that. So forth. That may not always be the final dialogue. You may come up with things later on. Once you see the artwork, it may inspire something different. It very often does. So that's a little bit of the peek behind the curtain.
Oh, you would maybe say it's more closer to writing. Well, I mean, you did say it, a screenplay for like a movie or just a play in general, as opposed to writing for a fiction novel.
Right, because in a fiction novel, you may go into a lot of metaphors, you may go into a lot of asides, you may go into a lot more internal monologue. Um, you may go off on 4 pages of description around what a park is, because the character is taking all that in as he or she is going through your story. But here, you're trying to kind of pace the things out and communicate certain things, and the asides that you're writing are probably to the artist. No one knows Madam X is the real villain yet, but she will be revealed by page 20 to be the villain. So, bear that in mind if you want to put any, certain visual hooks in there, to get us to that point. Um, so many people nowadays do write it like a sort of screenplay. And by that, I mean, they'll say page 1, panel 1, what the characters do. Here's the dialogue, almost like a screenplay is written. Then panel 2, what the characters are doing physically. Here's some dialogue or captions. Panel 3, and so forth. That I don't care for that as much. I find that's a
Okay.
little bit more limiting. I like, again, that sort of magic of being able to give an artist a fairly detailed plot with a lot of flow and intention in it. And then I've been very lucky. I've worked with a lot of really great artists. So I realize I'm fortunate in the fact that I'm used to getting things back then, that plus that story, and then inspire me to then do the script and the captions at that point with a bit more swagger, because I've seen some amazing artwork.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so when that art comes back to you,
Mm-hmm.
do you get any kind of chance to say, well, I don't like this or don't like that, and, kind of collaborate with the artist a little bit more, or how does that work?
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, there are times. I mean, if you have a good relationship with the artist, if you have a good relationship with the editor, the book's not backed up against the wall. Certainly you can make suggestions and say, well, this isn't what I was thinking, or this isn't what I was intending, and I'm sorry if it came across the wrong way, or I think this would work better this way. Now, the artist may choose to reject that. The editor may choose to reject that, both for editorial reasons and also maybe for scheduling reasons. Like, yes, you're right, but there's nothing we can do about that. Years ago, I wrote a Punisher Black Widow graphic novel that the artist really just unfortunately kind of ignored a very important plot point, and chose to do something different. And by the different, I mean they interpreted it differently. They just basically ignored something that was pretty important to see visually. And I called this out to the editor, and I said, "Geez, the whole thing's missing here." And he was like, "Yeah, I'm really sorry. We're behind schedule. You're going to have to solve it with the script." So it ended up being this very kludgy dialogue sequence where the characters had to describe something that's not even visually seen in order to advance the story. So that's not great. Um, and by way of comparison, this Daredevil Black Armor series I just did recently, Marvel had asked me to come back and tell a sort of a retro story with Daredevil that picked up on some things that I had done when I was on the book years ago, and I was teamed up with this great artist, new to me, Netho Diaz, who's been working in the industry for a while, and there was one sequence where Netho was thinking about breaking something up into multiple panels, and he had actually done it, I think, that way. He'd sketched it out in breakdowns, and I said, "Well, I trust you. I trust your visual approach totally. I think this would benefit more from a splash page, because I think there's so much going on in this issue, and you're jam packing so much in here. I think this one page would open the story up, right? It would give it some breathing room right here."
Yeah.
Um, and he took another look at it, and ultimately he agreed with that, and chose to go back and do that as that splash page. But I trusted what he was doing quite a bit there. So if he had wanted to back that off, I would have been, all right, let's go with what you think.
Cool. And that was actually something that I wanted to bring up. Uh, at least to me, when I was told that you were coming to Hershey Comic Con, and this was before I was asked to do any kind of podcasting or interviewing, your name was mentioned as one of the guests, and I thought, well, you mean the guy that wrote Daredevil: Fall from Grace, that Chichester.
I
Not
don't.
that I
Yeah,
think that I know there's if I don't know
there's
if
no
there's
other
any other
Chichester. Yeah,
Chichesters.
it's me.
Yeah,
Right.
but I thought, wow, that's how cool, getting to go there and getting to see him. Whose idea was it? You mentioned, so I guess Daredevil Fall from Grace was the start of Daredevil receiving his black armor. And then you had mentioned, I think the trade came out May of this year for the 4-issue limited series that you did. Was that your idea? Did you take that to Marvel and say, hey, I have another idea for this character? I believe that was a 90s story. Um,
It
or
sort
did
of
Marvel
takes.
come to you?
Yeah, Marvel came to me. I had been removed from the book. When I was writing it, the book had changed editorial offices. You know, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, God, and so I was removed from the book rather undiplomatically, and and I was off the book. So that was it. It was not no pawing at the window, please let me back in type of thing. And I figured that was it for Daredevil. So it was a bit of a shock and surprise, and good surprise, when Marvel approached me and said, "Would you be interested in coming back and doing another story in that time frame, like in that with a kind of a '90s feel to it, as if it's in a '90s, but not literally dated 30
Yeah,
years
yeah,
ago.
right.
There are nods to cell phones and things like that. So Marvel's '90s is more like 5 years ago
Yeah, right.
instead of 25 years ago. And so they approached me. They said they wanted to do like something with the black armor, but it was up to me to figure out what that would be. And so proposed some things. Uh, the editorial team was very good to work with. They came back with some, this is great. Why don't you try this to make it a little bit better? And it all snapped together, quite nicely.
Yeah, I would say so. I unfortunately haven't had a chance to get to read that yet. It is on my short list, but from what I understood, it was very, very well received, which is
Yes,
awesome.
yes, and please do let me know what you think of it when you have a chance to
I
read it.
I certainly will. Um, you again, I had mentioned that when I hear your name, I think Daredevil.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong with any of my information. But I believe you were on Daredevil from 91 to 95 pretty consistently, and I found 47 credits on the main Daredevil run. Does that seem accurate?
That seems right. I mean, I was the main Daredevil writer for the first half of the '90s, and there was a couple of sequences of issues. I took off purposefully, for various reasons. I think I was on a honeymoon, or I was moving, or when Scott McDaniel and I went to do the Elektra mini series that would follow Fall from Grace. We wanted to be able to focus on that. And so we had asked, that could somebody else cover the book for a couple issues. But I was the main, writer on that, for that stretch of time.
So I want to ask. When I think of Daredevil, I think of two writers, you and Frank Miller. Frank Miller wrote Daredevil for a really long time.
Yeah.
When you came onto it, was there any kind of like collaboration between you and him? Like, did he ever come to you and say, don't do this, or, I find it that this works best with this character? I mean, how much research actually goes into writing for a Daredevil or a Batman or a Judge Dredd, or, when you're just stepping
Mm-hmm.
into that character?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. No, there was nothing from Frank. I mean, I knew Frank a little bit from having been the assistant editor on Electra Assassin, which he had done with Bill Sienkiewicz, and then I would later be the editor on the trade paperback collection of that story. So I knew him a little bit, and but I don't know how much he remembered me or knew me. And certainly by the time I took on the book, which was after Annie Nesenti was leaving it, she had become the writer after Frank had left. I believe that was maybe Denny O'Neil was in there a little bit. Um, so there wasn't any direct kind of passing of the baton or, here's the keys to the car, kid, that sort of thing. And very much a kid, right? I was like 23, 24, at the time I would take this on. But there is, if you're smart, a lot of research you do because you want to do honor to the character and you're playing in a mutually shared sandbox. So there is power to the legacy of what people have done on the book. So just to kind of ignore it and say, well, I'm going to pretend nothing's ever happened before I started writing this book is foolish and arrogant, and also quite a bit losing the opportunities to draw from certain things. So I had been a big fan of Frank Miller's work. I've been a fan of Annie Nesenti's work, and so certainly had read those. Had read the Marvel Universe Handbook entries. Read some surrounding graphic. How the Billy Clubs work. How does the cane work? These are the things that you benefit from because the groundwork has been laid, and then maybe you find a seed of this or a seed of that opens up a new story idea, and so you invest yourself in that, and and maybe it inspires something directly, or maybe it pulls that seed gets planted and it crops up something a bit later.
Wow. So Fall from Grace, was Daredevil going to Black Armor? Was that your idea?
Yeah, I mean, it was me, Scott, the editorial office. Ralph Macchio was the editor. Pat Garrahy was the assistant editor. The book was not doing as strong sales wise as we want it, as Marvel want it. So there there was the need to kind of galvanize attention on the book. So we sort of adopted a kitchen sink approach to it and said, let's throw everything we can at it. Let's do a big event. Let's upend Matt Murdock's life. Let's throw lots of guest stars and guest villains in here. Raise the profile. Let's change the costume. Costume changes were a gimmick, and could be a successful gimmick if done right. So our difference, I think, is we tried to integrate that into the story. Why was he changing the costume? Was because he was being hit by all these threats, and all these threats were saying to him, well, I cannot help the people I'm supposed to help if I'm beaten to a pulp by these new threats that are coming around me. I have to have some more defense so that I can then defend others. So it was never meant to be Iron Man armor, right? It wasn't meant to be bolted on, titanium, adamantium, level type stuff, but it was a little bit more protection from the, from the ferocity of some folks, and then with that intention in mind, then I started to kind of think about, okay, what's the construction of the costume going to be? What's it going to be made of? And Scott would then go through many design iterations to arrive at that final look.
So in that storyline, you had mentioned that there was a bunch of guest stars and stuff, and I had it in my head. I think it's issue 3 or 4. Venom is in it. Mm-hmm. And do you go through the same processes of research when you bring, a character into your book for one issue? I mean, obviously you're not researching to have a real longevity writing the character, but do you spend as much time? Do you go back and look, okay, how does Venom hold his hand when he whips out his webbing or stuff like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're gonna do it right, I think you have to, because you want to understand the characters and the peculiarity and the specificity of the characters in order to get the right uh, intention of them. Like, why are they doing this? Why are they involved in this story? Um, and also the specificity and character of their language. How do they talk? You don't want everybody to talk the same way and
Sure.
say the same things. So those are some of the quick cues that you pick up on in order to bring in characters, as you say, that may not be for longevity, but you want to do service to them for the short term that they're in your book, so they feel right. Because if why am I putting Venom in the book? I'm putting Venom in the book because I want to attract all the hundreds of thousands, millions of Venom fans to look at my book for that month. So if they come to my book and they think, well, this is a crappy version of Venom, they're going to walk away disappointed and not want to continue with the story. If they come in and say, well, they did justice to Venom, uh, and this feels right, maybe they'll stick around a little bit more. They're not a Daredevil fan, but maybe they become one because Venom brought them into the book, and it was a good Venom that brought them into the book.
Yeah, makes total sense. So, speaking about bringing characters into a book, um, how did Batman end up in a Daredevil book?
Well, is it a Daredevil book or is it a Batman book? I guess it's a Daredevil book technically. Um, the in the olden days, Logan, things were a lot simpler. The editors were had worked together. The companies didn't have these large, engines of intellectual property lawyers surrounding them. So people had often been comparing Batman to Daredevil and Daredevil to Batman and saying Daredevil is Marvel's Batman and they should meet. Not necessarily true on that interpretation, but it had been the sort of background chatter for a long time. And so I had said to Ralph, what Ralph Macchio, the Daredevil editor, again, well, what about this? What about getting a sort of a Daredevil Batman team up, kind of going? And that was again much easier in those days, where the editors could almost just call each other and say, "What do you think?" And they'd say, "Yeah, I think so." And let's go talk to our publisher, and the publisher would run the sales potential, and as long as it added up to a certain number, they could just make it happen. So Denny O'Neil, who was the Batman editor, had been Ralph had been Denny's assistant at one point, so they had a close relationship. So it was easy for Ralph to call Denny and say, "Hey, I got an idea for a story, and what do you think?" And Denny wasn't against it. He said, "Well, we're going to have to go through the right approvals of the story, and I'm going to have to make sure it feels like the right Batman, and so forth." But it was kind of that easy play on sales and opportunity, and then two colleagues, Denny and Ralph, being able to make it happen with, like I said, as easy as a phone call. Now then, I had to work hard at a story that would satisfy not just Ralph, who I was used to making happy because he was my Daredevil editor, but also I had to make Denny happy, who was the Batman half of the equation.
Yeah. Is that the hardest comic book you've ever had to write?
No, I think the hardest comic book I ever had to write was there was an adaptation of a movie called Strange Days, which was a sort of a VR murder mystery that was, I think, produced by James Cameron, and uh,
Oh,
it was like a 48-page condensing of a screenplay, and it had to be done in like a weekend. So
oh,
it was pretty brutal. Um,
yeah,
and I don't think it's like the finest hour, but that was a slog.
yeah. Oh, time constraints. In
Yes.
our discussion with Keith William, we talked about time constraints quite a bit.
Oh, totally. Yep. Yeah.
They help nobody.
Yes. I mean, and Keith was, I'm sure, as he said, a big part of the bullpen at one point, and he was under the gun many times.
Yeah. So if like I have a hard time imagining, because things are the way they are right now, and I um truth be told, I have a relative who has been reading comics since long before I was born, and he calls me a baby nerd because I haven't really been into comics for much longer than a decade now. I mean, like really, really into them
Right.
for much longer
Right.
than a decade now. So I don't, that whole idea of calling up an editor over at DC and saying, hey, can we borrow Batman for a little bit, just blows my mind. I mean, I have sitting on a stand JLA/Avengers book,
Oh
the
yeah.
George
Yeah.
Perez one.
Yeah. Right.
I have that displayed because like that whole concept is crazy, and to just you kind of like scratch your head one day and go, well, let's give the people what they want, right? And then make a phone
Mm-hmm.
call, like that's wild.
Mm-hmm.
Growing up, were you reading both Marvel and DC? I mean, did you have a little bit of knowledge going into what Batman should be, or did you like only read Marvel when you were younger? I mean, what did that whole process look
Um,
like for you?
younger, when I was saying I was a reader, as a kid, I was mostly into DCs. I
Oh,
rarely read
okay.
Marvel. I read enough Marvel to know who they were. Right, I knew who Thor was. I knew Hulk. I knew who everybody was, but I didn't like them that much. They felt a little too dense for me, and I glommed onto the lighter touch, if you will, of the DC books. So Green Lantern, The Flash were probably, two of my favorites. I liked Batman a lot, not to an obsessive, level. I liked their mystery books, their horror books, House of Mystery
Yeah.
and such. The Phantom Stranger, who to this day I couldn't tell you exactly what he was about, but I liked him. He felt like a sort of a Twilight Zoney figure. um, so that was more my my cup of tea. But I did know enough of the Marvel work that, again, when I got the job at Marvel, I was very quickly able to have demonstrate a familiarity with all the characters, which had to be some of the part of what got me the job.
Yeah, yeah. So how much of this Daredevil Batman book was you kind of getting to write someone that you read when you were young? I mean, how much did that influence your, yeah, I want to do this?
Um, I think it's much more. Ultimately, it's, well, Batman's there. It. I think I leaned more in Daredevil's direction to some extent. So it's not. There's a coexistence in the two characters in the story, but it probably weights itself 55-60% in Daredevil's direction a little bit.
Sure.
And the initial draft was terrible. The initial storyline, I can't remember exactly what it was, except I know it sucked. And I knew it sucked when I turned it in, and Ralph was like, yeah, this sucks, and we're not even sending this to Denny. Um, and then I went back to the drawing board, and that's where I then discovered. Have you read the book? Have you seen it?
I tell you what, it actually, I bought a first printing and it just got to my house this week and I haven't had a chance.
No worries. I mean, I wasn't going to belabor a point if you already knew this, but one of the key ideas, in it, which I was really proud of, was running with the idea that Matt Murdock's a lawyer and Harvey Dent, who's Two-Face,
Mm-hmm.
was a lawyer, and so I went with the idea that they had known each other in law school, and that was something that became a really interesting riff on character and motivation and such, and it kind of enriched the story. So it wasn't something that I had been thinking about or had this idea for a long time, but once you sort of brought those worlds together, and this is what happens, I think, when you let the pieces sort of pull you along and you let the flow of the story happen versus forcing something on it, is that kind of discovery gave much more of a heart to the story than I had originally thought it was going to have in that way. So it wasn't so much like, oh, I finally get to write Batman. It was more, just the interesting qualities of some of these characters, within. And then Two-Face became, very interesting to me.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, I feel he is an underrated Batman villain. I know he's one of the more famous ones, but I think he is very underused. And what a great idea to have them go to law school together. I wouldn't have thought of it, but that's awesome. And I guarantee I have that read before the end of the week.
Oh, well, again, let me know
I
what you think of it. I'm
Yeah,
really happy with how it turned out.
yeah. I can't wait. They are Batman is large and far my favorite DC character,
Mm-hmm.
and Daredevil is in my top three of Marvel. So when I was doing research for this interview and found that you were actually the writer of that, I thought, well, I have to have it now. I can't wait any longer. So I went out and found a copy.
There's one
You
other one.
have
There's one that Alan Grant did as well.
Yes,
So that's terrific. Alan's a great writer.
yeah, I seen that one as well. But I'll get to them all eventually, maybe someday, hopefully.
Exactly.
But you've been in the comic industry for about what 40 years, I believe. I think you said 84 was when you got hired at Marvel.
Yeah, I worked very consistently as an editor and writer, and then sometimes freelance editor. From that first job, 84 to about 99. But the market had crashed pretty severely
Yeah,
in the mid 90s. 96, 97, and it became a lot harder to kind of maintain gigs and jobs, and not impossible, but harder. And I was looking in a lot of different directions, and I think in retrospect I could have kept more of a hand in comics a little bit, but I leaned much more into some doors that opened in marketing and advertising, and focused really on that for about the last 20 25 years. God
yeah,
help me. So the comics has really only come back in terms of going to conventions. Now this Daredevil series, now these black box, projects, with within the last, really 4 years or so.
yeah. So inconsistently, maybe is
Hmm.
the word to use over the 40
Yes,
years. But
inconsistently. Yes,
do
inconsistently. Yes.
do you have a favorite work that you have done? Like what would be if you could hand me something and say this was my best work writing a comic.
Well, I'm very proud of what we did with this Black Armor series. I mean, I think it's a maturity as a writer, and sort of is kind of a best of what maybe I was good at, now funneled, channeled through a lot more discipline, and skill set. The other thing I might hand you, which is really going to depend entirely on your your taste or lack thereof, is probably a series I created called Terror Incorporated, which was about a boogeyman sort of assassin, who could steal people's body parts and use those parts to leverage their skills. So he could steal a marksman's eye and become an expert sniper. He could steal a locksmith's hand so he could open a vault and those sort of things. So he was pretty gruesome, but he was very erudite and very precision oriented. So his whole shtick was, this is just business. I'm just doing this, even while he was doing the most grisly, awful things. To as a mercenary, and as a bit of a murderer. But
Yeah.
I had a ball with it, and I always felt like it was a character that kind of just wrote himself in a lot of ways. And it's not probably certainly not the most well known thing, but every time I run into somebody who does know it, uh, I've yet to find somebody who cites it and says, "Wow, that didn't work for me." It's almost always like, "Wow, that was really something."
Well, I'm gonna add that to the list too. I am very intrigued by that. Um, how about favorite work that is not yours? I mean, do you still currently read comics? Do you have time for that, or is it something that?
Yeah, yeah. I've been very excited about a lot of comics. Nowadays. I mean, if I'm going back in time, some of the stuff I worked on as an editor, Electro Assassin as an assistant editor, and then as I said, I edited the collected edition. That was mind blowing. Um, Born Again came out around that time as well. Still stands head and shoulders, above so many things. For me, I edited a book called Martial Law by Pat Mills and Kevin O'Neill, which was sort of a proto The Boys. If you ever have a chance to see that, you'll recognize Homelander's costume very much so in that book. Um, and Nowadays I try to read as much as I can. I've recently come across Harrow County, which is kind of like a supernatural, trippy Appalachian kind of ghost story sort of tales, which I'm very impressed with. Kill Lock, which was a series about a sentient galaxy of robots and how four convicted robots are sort of joined together, and they have to figure out how to escape this kill lock, this system that's going to destroy them if they separate from each other. So they're on the run and trying to kind of figure out their freedom at the same time. That was a really impressive series for me. So those are a couple that jump immediately to mind.
All right. Well, I wrote a couple of those down
Mm-hmm.
for me to check out, and you know, I'll do an episode where I review one of them and call it
see,
a
see what
suggestion
you
from
think.
Dan Chichester. That'll be
Yeah,
something.
by all means.
Um, do you? And we're kind of backtracking here a little bit, and I look up at the time, and my gosh, we've been going 50 minutes, and I feel like we just sat down 10 minutes ago. But just a couple of quick things to hit, and I'll let you go and let you get to bed, and I'll probably do the same here. But
Yeah,
do
exactly.
you remember when you got your first comic book?
You mean the first, like as a kid? You mean like reading
Yes.
comics there? Yeah. Um, I was idolized my cousin Mark, my older cousin Mark, and he was just older enough that he wanted nothing to do with me, right?
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was probably four or 5 years older than me. And So to get rid of me, he gave me not a box, but a barrel of comics and Mad magazines and such. So it's just like he dumped them on me, like go occupy yourself, kid. With this stuff. So that to me was digging then through that, and then finding some gems and whatever. I can't remember like what the exact ones would have been in that collection, but they were all over the map. There was probably some Archies and some superheroes, and as I said, certainly some Mad magazines and things in there. That really was the the gateway drugs, I guess you might say,
Yeah.
to that interest. And then from there, it was like, wow, putting them in piles, and I like this, and I like this, and then starting to kind of then go to the local newsstand every week and finding the things that I liked, and then from there I could cite different things that jumped off the shelf at me.
So so how often does Mark try to take credit for your career?
Unfortunately, not so much in touch, with him
Oh, okay.
anymore. So he's sort of going off on his own life, and I may have told him that story once as an adult, and I don't think it made much impression on him. But so
So the last thing that we really have to touch on, or have to, I guess isn't probably the right word. The last thing
hmm
that I want to touch on is you mentioned that recently your involvement with comics is more or less conventions. So, what's it like for you going to a convention?
it's gotten better. I hadn't gone to a convention, in 20 years probably, and I had been invited to the Terrificon convention, which is a really great convention in the Northeast, and usually it's the Mohegan Suns Casino in Connecticut, and comes up at the end of August or mid-August this year, and I had been invited there, and probably right after the world started to open up again, right? So it was right, the summer of 2021, or whatever, in that place. So and I remember driving there. It was about halfway there, which is not far from here. It's about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours tops. And I was turned around. Right, I almost came back home because I was like, "What? Why am I going to this? I have nothing to promote. I'm not working on anything currently. I have nothing like to sell, like I don't have comics or anything to sell." And but I pushed through, and I got there, and I was just really touched and kind of overjoyed by the people who came up to me who had read the books, when they had come out, and they had meant something to them. They liked the stories. They remembered the stories. Maybe it was the first Daredevil story they had written, or it was a horror story that stuck with them. So it was a way to connect with readers that I didn't even remember having when I would go to the occasional convention when I was in the thick of things. I think when I was in the thick of things, I was a lot more, sort of feeling like I was under the microscope, I guess, a little bit. Like, oh, I'm going to be judged on what I'm writing next, and when am I writing next, and what am I working on next. And this just felt a little bit more like a celebration of storytelling and writing and enjoying comics, and that's been the vibe I try to maintain as I go to these shows, and have a chance to kind of meet people and talk with them, and just to try to enjoy it. If I happen to be working on something like the Daredevil series, that's great, that's gravy, but it's not about that, right? It's not about like, oh, I've got something new coming out next week, because I might not, and probably don't.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to enjoy the participation with fans, and enjoying that they're enjoying things. Sometimes I'm at the table, and I may not be the most well-known person in the row. Maybe I am, but I may not be. So sometimes you just engage with people as they kind of go past, and try to help them enjoy the show that much more, right? I mean, there's been many times, I've started kind of a conversation with somebody, just based on like catching their eye and pulling them over, and seeing how they're doing, having a good time at the show, and the fact that they're enjoying the pop cultureness of it all, and that works for me too.
Yeah. So I like from the other side of the table, it's always um, overly appreciated when I am going by a table and someone pulls you aside and talk, and it really
Mm-hmm.
is the whole community of it, and
Yes,
engrossing
yes,
yourself in that pop culture that is a joy to me to go. And I know exactly when I'm going to be at my next convention, and unless you're going to one this weekend, it's probably going to be your next convention as well, and that's Hershey Comic Con on June 29th and June 30th in Hershey,
exactly,
Pennsylvania.
exactly. Yes, I look forward to that a lot. That's going to be fun. Uh, uh, have not been back in that area for a while, and So it is Saturday and Sunday, last weekend in June. So hopefully, folks who are hearing this will come by and say hi to me and many other great people who are going to be there.
Yeah, and it is a great lineup of guests. So, including yourself and the other creators that we have
Mm-hmm.
already talked to and will talk to for the show, as well as some of the vendors showing up. I've gotten to know a couple of them over the years. I mean, it is the Hershey Comic Con is going to be a lot of fun. I had made mention to someone, I can't remember if it was on the show or off the show, but back in 2019, I went to New York Comic Con, and I
Okay.
think I am just excited for the Hershey Comic Con as I was going to
Oh,
the New
wow.
York big one.
Wow.
I'm really excited for this one. So
Well,
I
it's probably not as big as New York, I'm imagining, but sometimes that allows you. Very often, I shouldn't say sometimes. Very often, that allows you to connect with people more, and there's a tremendous value, as you said, in that community feeling.
Oh yeah. The don't get me wrong, the New York Comic Con experience was incredible, but
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would like to go back and do it again, but I would do it a lot smarter this time. But I do
Right.
enjoy the smaller, more regional conventions, and I mean, we're doing this in Hershey, and you and Keith Williams and Bob Ullman and Mark Wade and Jim Shooter and the list goes on and on. There is not a lack of star power just because it
Oh
is a
no,
smaller convention.
no. I mean, if folks have not looked at the site and they're listening to this in advance, go do yourself a favor and you will see a ton of talent, both legacy, like myself, I'd say, and and current folks. And yeah, it looks like a great lineup and a great opportunity to enjoy comics. Through as a reader, but also, a lot of times I go to these things and there's people who want to get into comics, they want to write, they want to illustrate. So this is a great opportunity to talk to people who have done it or are doing it, and gain, uh, from their experience. Show your work off, ask questions.
Yeah, again, it's just the great community that comes with a convention. I'm looking up at our time, and we have hit an hour. Typically, I like to be winding down by the 45-minute mark. So the last thing I have to ask for you is there anything that you're working on, anything that you want to plug before we get off of here?
Not really. I mean, it's I have a crowdfunded book, as I mentioned to you. That the second issue, it's called Axel's Infernal. It's a bit of a grindhouse supernatural road trip, sort of a story about truckers delivering hell on earth. But it is we're moving into the second issue, but if you follow me on or just visit me, you have to follow me, but check on me on Twitter and Instagram under just DG Chichester. You'll see probably some word of that in the next month or so, and folks can see more about that and maybe sign up for notices and then hopefully back it as it gets to that point in time.
All right. Well, Dan, I can't thank you enough for coming on here. This was a ton of fun.
Great, thank
Um,
you, Logan. Yeah, it's a
and
lot of
I
fun.
actually learned quite a bit about the writing of the comic process, and I'm hopefully the others listening to this learned just as much as I did. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you again for the chance to say hi, and I look forward to saying hi in person in a couple weeks.
Oh, absolutely. And until next time, guys, get out there and save the world, you bunch of heroes.